The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Dr. Elena Crow Feather stared at the clipboard in her trembling hands. Bobcat number 4291, euthanasia scheduled, Wednesday, 1 p.m. 48 hours. That's all the time left for the creature curled in the corner of the concrete enclosure. Spirit, the name seemed cruel now, barely lifted his magnificent head as she approached. Those amber eyes held something that made her stomach clench. Intelligence, understanding, as if he knew exactly what that clipboard meant. Some creatures are too good for this world, her grandmother used to say, and some worlds aren't good enough for certain creatures. Elena's pen hovered over the final authorization. 5 months of failed rehabilitation. No progress toward release. State policy was clear. Non-releasable animals must be... The phone rang. Her hand jerked, pen clattering to the floor. Through the chain link, Spirit's ears swiveled toward the sound. Waiting. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Wild Heart Sanctuary. This is Maria Standing Bear. The voice on the other end carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much suffering and refused to look away. I heard through the network you have a bobcat facing the needle. Elena's grip tightened on the phone. Wild Heart was legendary among wildlife rehabilitators, a small sanctuary nestled in the Montana mountains known for taking on cases other facilities had given up on. Maria, I need to be straight with you. This animal, he's been here 5 months with zero progress, complete psychological shutdown. Tell me about his intelligence level, problem solving, recognition patterns. Elena paused, watching Spirit through the glass. Actually, that's what makes this so heartbreaking. He's brilliant, learns our routines, recognizes voices, even seems to understand when we're discussing his case. But he won't hunt, won't show any wild behaviors. It's like he's given up on being what he was born to be. I might have a placement, Maria said quietly. Samuel and Grace Whitehorse. They're special people. 60 miles north, Samuel Whitehorse sat in his recliner, staring at the empty chair across from him where his son David used to sit during leave visits. At 67, the retired rancher carried himself like a man who'd lost more than he could bear. 7 years since the Marines had knocked on his door. 7 years since his world had collapsed. Grace emerged from the kitchen, moving carefully. At 65, she still possessed the quiet strength that had drawn Samuel to her 40 years ago. But lately, she'd been forgetting things, small things, the kind of things that terrified them both in the sleepless hours before dawn. That was Maria Standing Bear on the phone, Grace said, settling into her chair. She wants to know if we'd consider fostering a bobcat. Samuel's weathered hands tightened on his coffee mug. Grace, you know what the state inspector said. 1 more animal and they'll review our permits for Luna and Cooper. When you're down to your last prayer, Grace replied, using her grandmother's old saying, that's when miracles happen. Outside their window, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly, indifferent to human grief. But somewhere in those mountains, Elder Joseph Blackhorse was preparing for a ceremony he'd been expecting for 7 years. The spirits, he knew, didn't work on human timelines. Back at the rehabilitation center, Elena found herself studying Spirit with new eyes. Something about Maria's call had shifted the air in the room. The bobcat was watching her with those impossibly intelligent amber eyes, as if he too sensed that change was coming. 46 hours, she whispered to him. Can you hang on for 46 more hours? Spirit's ear twitched once. Whether in acknowledgement or coincidence, Elena chose to believe it was hope. The letter was dated 7 years ago, written in David Whitehorse's careful handwriting on military stationery that had yellowed with time. Grace found it tucked behind his Purple Heart display, a hiding place she'd never thought to check until today. the day Maria Standing Bear had called about the bobcat. Dear Mom and Dad, there's something I can't tell you in my regular letters, something classified that might not make sense anyway. We have these animals here, not pets, not mascots, something else entirely. Samuel's hands shook as he read over his wife's shoulder. David had been 22 when he deployed with Marine Unit 442 to Afghanistan. Young, eager, carrying the weight of family expectations and his own fierce determination to serve. The last conversation they'd had before deployment still haunted Samuel's nightmares. "You don't have to prove anything to me, son," Samuel had said, standing in this very kitchen. "There's no shame in finding another path." "This is my path, Dad." David's jaw had been set with that stubborn white-horse determination. "I'm not running from anything. I'm running toward something." "And what if that something gets you killed?" The words had hung between them like a curse. David had left for Afghanistan 2 days later. Samuel never got the chance to take them back. Grace continued reading David's hidden letter aloud, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "The therapy animal program here is revolutionary, Dad. These aren't domestic animals broken down into compliance. They're wild creatures who've chosen to help us heal. There's this bobcat, amber eyes like liquid gold, smarter than half the officers I know. He somehow knows which soldiers are struggling before we do." Samuel closed his eyes, remembering David's childhood obsession with tracking animals through their ranch land. The boy could read animal behavior like others read books, a gift that had seemed irrelevant to military service. How wrong Samuel had been. "His name is Spirit, and I swear he saved more lives than any of our medical equipment. Yesterday, Private Martinez was having a breakdown, flashbacks from the IED attack that took his squad. Spirit just appeared, pressed against Martinez's chest, and somehow guided him through breathing exercises none of us could teach him. It was like watching a miracle in fur." Grace's grandmother had always insisted that animals were messengers from the spirit world, carriers of wisdom that humans had forgotten. Samuel had dismissed such talk as superstition, even after 40 years of marriage to a woman whose Lakota heritage ran deep as mountain roots. Now, reading his son's words, he wondered what else he'd been blind to. "The thing is, Dad, Spirit bonded with me in a way the handlers say they've never seen. He follows me everywhere, sleeps by my bunk, seems to know when I'm having the dreams about home. The dreams where I'm arguing with you again, where I can't make you understand that some things are worth the risk." Samuel's coffee mug slipped from numb fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor. Grace reached for his hand, her own trembling with the weight of recognition. They'd both been having those dreams, David trying to tell them something, always just beyond hearing. "If something happens to me, and I'm not being morbid, just realistic, I've arranged for Spirit to be transferred to a sanctuary program. The coordinates are 47.0527 degree N, 114.0059 degree W. I checked on a map, Dad. That's about 60 miles from our ranch. Probably just coincidence, but you always taught me not to believe in coincidences." Grace gasped. Those coordinates were exactly where Maria Standing Bear's Wild Heart Sanctuary operated. Samuel felt the room spinning, reality reshaping itself around this impossible revelation. "I know you're reading this after I'm gone because I've hidden it, where you'll only look if you need to find something I left behind. Mom's probably with you. She always could sense things before they happened. Tell her she was right about the signs. Tell her the eagle feather she gave me saved my life twice before it couldn't save me a third time." They'd found that eagle feather in David's personal effects, returned with his flag and medals. Grace had woven it into a dream catcher that hung in their bedroom, a talisman against the nightmares that came like clockwork every night at 0300 hours. "Spirit's not just a therapy animal, Dad. He's my guardian angel with amber eyes and a purr that sounds like distant thunder. If he ever finds his way to you, don't think of it as coincidence. Think of it as me keeping my promise to come home." The letter was signed with David's full name and rank, but at the bottom, in smaller script, were words that broke Samuel's heart. "I'm sorry for our last fight, Dad. You were right. Some things aren't worth the risk, but protecting the people I love, that will always be worth everything." Grace folded the letter carefully, her movements deliberate and reverent. "Samuel, that Bobcat Maria called about is named Spirit," he finished, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "David's Spirit." Outside their kitchen window, Elder Joseph Blackhorse was walking up their drive, carrying a bundle of sage and sweetgrass. His weathered face wore the expression of a man who'd been expecting this day for exactly 7 years. "The 7-year mourning period ends today," Grace whispered, remembering her grandmother's teachings. "The spirits can finally come home." Samuel's cell phone buzzed with a text from Maria Standing Bear. "Transport arranged for tomorrow. Spirit seems agitated tonight, like he knows he's going somewhere important. GPS coordinates you provided match exactly. Some things are meant to be." "Blood doesn't make family," Grace said, using another of her grandmother's sayings. "Loyalty does. And David was always loyal to his promises." Samuel walked to the window where David's compass still sat on the sill, its needle pointing steadily northwest toward Wildheart Sanctuary, toward Spirit, toward the possibility that their son had found a way to keep his word after all. In 36 hours, if they could navigate the legal challenges and community pressure, they would meet the Bobcat who had been David's guardian angel, the wild creature who carried their son's love home in amber eyes and a warrior's heart. The transport van pulled into the White Horse Ranch at exactly 6:00 p.m. Monday evening, 31 hours before the euthanasia deadline. Samuel and Grace stood on their porch, hands clasped together, watching Maria. Standing Bear and her assistant carefully unload a large crate from the specialized vehicle. Spirit hadn't made a sound during the 3-hour journey, but the moment the van stopped, a low, chirping call emerged from the crate. Not the snarl or hiss anyone expected, but something almost conversational, as if he were announcing his arrival. "That's not typical Bobcat vocalization," Maria said quietly, her weathered hands gentle on the crate's handle. "He's been making that sound for the last 50 miles, ever since we entered your county." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Her grandmother had always insisted that spirits announce themselves to family. "Those eyes," she whispered, as they carried the crate toward the prepared enclosure. "I've seen them before." The secure holding area Samuel had constructed over the weekend connected to their house through a series of tunnels, an innovation he'd designed after years of working with traumatized animals. Spirit could choose his level of interaction, retreating to wild spaces when overwhelmed or venturing closer when curiosity overcame caution. Cooper, their 8-year-old golden retriever, approached the crate with his tail wagging in that slow, respectful way he reserved for nervous animals. Luna, their border collie rescue with her own PTSD history, hung back but showed none of the anxiety Samuel had expected. Instead, she tilted her head with an expression of recognition that made Grace's breath catch. "It's like they know him," Grace murmured. When they opened the crate in the secure enclosure, Spirit emerged with movements that defied his recent captivity. He didn't cower or hide. Instead, he positioned himself in the center of the space and began what could only be described as a territorial assessment, methodical, professional, like a soldier surveying a new base. "Look at how he moves," Samuel observed, his military training recognizing something familiar. "That's not random exploration. He's checking sight lines, escape routes, defensive positions." Spirit's amber eyes swept the area, cataloging every detail before settling on Samuel with an intensity that made the older man's chest tighten. For a long moment they stared at each other across the chain-link barrier. Then Spirit did something unprecedented. He approached the fence and sat down in a perfect military at-ease position. "Jesus Christ," Samuel breathed. "That's a trained stance." Maria's radio crackled to life. "Maria, this is dispatch. We've got a problem. State Inspector Williams just called. He's moving his visit up to tomorrow morning instead of Wednesday. Someone in town tipped him off about the transport." The Facebook group Concerned Citizens of Pine Valley had been busy. Samuel's neighbor, Janet Morrison, had posted a blurry photo of the transport van with the caption, "Dangerous predator arrives in our neighborhood. These people are putting our children at risk. Inspector Williams needs to shut this down now." The post had generated 47 comments in the past hour, ranging from concerned to vitriolic. "What happens when this thing gets hungry? My kids play in these woods. This is exactly how those horror stories start." But buried among the fear-mongering were other voices. Tom Bradley, a Vietnam veteran from down the road. "These folks have been helping animals for 15 years without incident. Maybe we should trust their judgment." Sarah Crow Dog, Elder Joseph's granddaughter. "My grandfather says this animal has medicine. We should listen before we judge." Spirit seemed oblivious to the controversy brewing online. He had discovered David's compass, which Samuel had placed near the enclosure as a test. The Bobcat approached it with reverence, sniffing carefully before lying down beside it, his massive head resting inches from the instrument that had guided his former human through foreign battlefields. "He knows," Grace whispered. "Somehow, he knows." Elder Joseph Blackhorse arrived just as the sun began setting behind the mountains, carrying bundles of sage and sweetgrass. At 73, the Lakota elder moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd witnessed enough life to understand its mysteries. "Grandfather," Grace greeted him in Lakota, using the respectful term for elders. Joseph studied Spirit through the fence, his weathered face unreadable. "The 7-year journey ends tonight," he said finally. "This one carries the spirit of a warrior. He has traveled far to find his way home." Spirit's ears swiveled toward Joseph's voice, and he rose to approach the elder with none of the wariness he'd shown the state veterinarian. Instead, he pressed against the fence closest to Joseph and began purring, a sound like distant thunder that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "Mitakuya Oyasing," Joseph whispered. "We are all related." Samuel's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Elena Crow Feather at the Rehabilitation Center. "How's he settling in? Something strange? I found his original intake photos, and there's a partial military tag visible in his matted fur. Couldn't make out the numbers, but thought you should know." Grace's hands flew to her mouth. "Samuel, show him David's photograph." With trembling fingers, Samuel pulled out his wallet and removed the photo he'd carried for 7 years. David, in full military dress uniform taken just before deployment. He held it up to the fence. Spirit's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He pressed against the chain link, making that soft chirping sound again, but now it carried a note of recognition, of longing. His amber eyes fixed on the photograph with an intensity that made Maria gasp. "That's not possible," she breathed. "Bobcats don't have that kind of facial recognition memory." But Spirit was doing something else that defied explanation. He had positioned himself in the exact same stance as David in the photograph, alert, proud, protective. Then he looked directly at Samuel and Grace, as if presenting himself for inspection. "Some gifts come wrapped in strange packages," Grace said, using one of her grandmother's favorite sayings. The evening news van arrived just as they were finishing Spirit's first feeding. Channel 7's lead reporter, Michelle Santos, had caught wind of the story through the Facebook controversy. Mr. Whitehorse, neighbors are expressing concern about public safety. How do you respond to accusations that you're harboring a dangerous predator? Samuel looked at Spirit, who had finished eating and was now grooming himself with the methodical precision of a creature completely comfortable in his surroundings. That animal has more discipline and sense than half the people commenting on social media. He's been here 4 hours, and he's shown nothing but respect for our boundaries and our other animals. The camera rolled as Spirit demonstrated his point. When Cooper approached with his favorite tennis ball, Spirit gently deflected it with his paw. Not aggressively, but with clear communication that playtime wasn't appropriate while strangers were present. It was a level of social awareness that made even the skeptical cameraman pause. "This is unprecedented behavior," Michelle Santos reported to her viewers. The animal seems to understand not just basic social cues, but complex situational appropriateness. As the news crew packed up their equipment, Samuel's phone rang. The caller ID showed Inspector Williams. "Mr. Whitehorse, I'll be there at 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning for a full inspection. I've been getting calls all evening about this animal. If I find any safety violations, any at all, this placement ends immediately." 29 hours until the euthanasia deadline. Samuel looked at Spirit, who had settled into a sphinx-like position facing the house, amber eyes alert but peaceful, protecting, waiting. "When the going gets tough," Samuel told Grace, borrowing an old American saying, "the tough get going." Grace squeezed his hand. David always said that, right before he did something brave and probably stupid. Through the fence, Spirit's purr rumbled like a promise in the growing darkness. The discovery came at dawn when Samuel approached Spirit's enclosure with the morning feeding. Hidden beneath the bobcat's thick neck fur, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a worn military identification tag. Samuel's hands trembled as he read the faded stamping. "Therapy Unit 442, Afghanistan Memorial Base, property of U.S. Marine Corps. Unit 442. The same unit designation David had written about in his hidden letters. "Grace!" Samuel's voice cracked across the morning silence. "Grace, come here right now." Spirit sat calmly as Samuel photographed the tag with his phone, zooming in on the serial numbers and military insignia. The bobcat's amber eyes held a patience that seemed almost human, as if he understood the significance of this moment. Grace arrived breathless, her coffee mug forgotten in the kitchen. When Samuel showed her the photograph on his phone screen, she sank to her knees beside the fence. "Dear God," she whispered. "He really is David's spirit." Maria, Standing Bear's phone rang 3 times before she answered. "Samuel? It's barely 6 in the morning." "Maria, you need to get out here immediately. And bring whatever paperwork you have about Spirit's background. We just found a military tag." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Samuel thought the call had dropped. Finally, Maria's voice came back, carefully controlled. "Samuel, there's something I haven't told you. I was contacted by someone from the Department of Defense last week. They've been tracking Spirit through the rehabilitation network." "What do you mean, tracking him?" "The military therapy animal program was classified. When animals were retired or when their handlers were killed, they were supposed to be transferred to specific facilities. Spirit went missing during transport 18 months ago. The military has been quietly searching for him ever since." Samuel's blood ran cold. "Are you telling me they want him back?" "I'm telling you that a Colonel Patricia Hayes from Marine Animal Services is driving up from Colorado Springs right now. She'll be here by noon." Through the fence, Spirit had positioned himself protectively between Samuel and the driveway, as if sensing approaching conflict. His muscular frame was coiled with tension, ears swiveling at every sound. Grace's phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. The Concerned Citizens of Pine Valley group had exploded overnight. Janet Morrison had posted the news footage from the previous evening, and the comments had turned vicious. "Look at how that thing is staring at the reporter," one comment read. "Those are predator eyes sizing up prey." "My sister lives 2 miles from there," another added. "I'm keeping my kids inside until this is resolved." But other voices were emerging from the digital chaos. Tom Bradley had shared a photo of his own service dog, writing, "I've seen what the right animal can do for a broken soldier. Maybe we should listen before we judge." Sarah Crow Dog posted a video of her grandfather, Elder Joseph, speaking in both Lakota and English. "This animal carries medicine. Fear makes us forget that healing comes in many forms." The post that made Samuel's chest tighten was from Angela Rodriguez, a Gold Star mother whose son had served in Afghanistan. "If this Bobcat helped our soldiers heal, shouldn't we be honored to give him a safe home? My boy wrote about therapy animals that saved lives. Maybe this is how we honor their service." At 9 a.m., Inspector Williams arrived with his clipboard and measuring tape, followed closely by 2 news vans from competing stations. The story had gone regional overnight, picked up by military family networks and animal rights groups across the country. "Mr. Whitehorse," Inspector Williams said, his voice official and cold, "I need to see every inch of this operation. Food storage, medical records, containment protocols. One violation and this animal is removed immediately." Spirit watched the inspection with remarkable composure. When Williams approached his enclosure, the Bobcat didn't retreat or show aggression. Instead, he sat in that same military at-ease position Samuel had noticed the day before, as if presenting himself for review. "That's unusual behavior," Williams admitted grudgingly. "Most wildcats show stress responses to strangers." "Most wildcats weren't trained to work with humans in combat zones," Samuel replied. At 11:30 a.m., a military sedan pulled into the driveway. Colonel Patricia Hayes stepped out wearing full dress blues, her bearing sharp and professional. She was younger than Samuel had expected, maybe 45, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitehorse," she said, extending her hand. "I apologize for the short notice. We've been searching for this animal for 18 months. Maria Standing Bear had arrived minutes earlier, bringing a thick folder of documentation. "Colonel, before we discuss ownership, you need to understand what this family has been through." Colonel Hayes' expression softened slightly when Grace showed her David's hidden letters and the compass he'd carried through 3 deployments. "Sergeant Whitehorse was one of our finest Marines," she said quietly. "His handler reports about Spirit were extraordinary." "Then you know how much Spirit meant to him," Grace said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I also know how much Spirit meant to the entire therapy program. His success rate with PTSD cases was unprecedented. We have active duty Marines who could benefit from his specialized training." Samuel felt his temper rising. "So you're here to take away the only connection we have left to our son?" "I'm here to determine what's best for a valuable military asset," Colonel Hayes replied, but her tone suggested the words didn't sit well even with her. Spirit had been watching this exchange with growing agitation. As the conversation grew more heated, he began pacing his enclosure, not the random movement of a caged animal, but the methodical patrol of a sentinel on duty. Suddenly he stopped and made a sound none of them had heard before, a sharp, urgent bark that cut through the human arguments like a knife. Everyone turned toward the enclosure. Spirit was positioned at the fence closest to the house, his body rigid with alert intensity. His amber eyes were fixed on something beyond their field of vision. "What is he?" Colonel Hayes began. The front door of the house burst open, and Cooper came racing across the yard, barking frantically. Behind him, Luna emerged from the house, moving in an unusual gait, weaving slightly, disoriented. "Grace!" Samuel shouted, understanding immediately. "Grace, where are you?" They found her collapsed in the kitchen, conscious but confused, her speech slurred and her right hand trembling. The symptoms Samuel had been dreading for months were finally declaring themselves with terrifying clarity. "I'm fine," Grace insisted, but her words came out thick and uncertain. Just, just tired. What were we talking about?" As Samuel called 911, Colonel Hayes stood in stunned silence. Spirit had somehow detected Grace's medical episode before any human had noticed the signs. The Bobcat was now pressed against the fence closest to the house, vocalizing in low, urgent tones. "How did he know?" the colonel asked Maria. "How did he detect that before we did?" "The same way he detected PTSD episodes in Afghanistan," Maria replied quietly. "The same way he knew David was struggling before anyone else could see it. Some animals are born with gifts we don't understand." The ambulance arrived within minutes, but Grace's confusion was already clearing. "I'm sorry," she said to the paramedics. "I don't know what happened. One minute I was fine, the next—" "Blood pressure spike," the lead paramedic diagnosed after checking her vitals. "Could be stress. Could be something else. We should take you in for observation." "No," Grace said firmly, her clarity returning with stubborn determination. "I'm not leaving Spirit. Not today." Colonel Hayes had been observing the entire scene with the calculating eye of someone trained to assess tactical situations. "Mr. Whitehorse," she said finally, "may I see those letters from your son again?" Samuel handed over David's correspondence, watching as the colonel read with growing recognition. "These therapy sessions," he describes, "Spirit was specifically bonded to your son for over 2 years. In military terms, that creates a primary attachment that doesn't transfer easily." "What are you saying, Colonel?" Patricia Hayes looked at Spirit, who had calmed now that Grace was receiving medical attention, but remained vigilantly positioned where he could monitor the situation. "I'm saying that forcing a therapy animal to abandon his chosen family could be considered cruel and counterproductive to his training." Maria stepped forward. "There's precedent for retired military animals remaining with civilian families who can provide appropriate care." "The good Lord works in mysterious ways," Grace said from her chair on the porch, using one of her grandmother's favorite sayings. "Maybe David knew we'd need Spirit as much as he did." Colonel Hayes made a decision that would change military policy for decades to come. "I'm recommending that Spirit be granted veteran status and allowed to remain with his chosen family, subject to regular welfare inspections and continued documentation of his therapeutic value." The news cameras captured the moment when Inspector Williams grudgingly signed the approval forms, muttering that he'd never seen anything like it in 30 years of wildlife management. But the most powerful image came when Colonel Hayes approached Spirit's enclosure to officially transfer his care. The Bobcat approached the fence, looked her directly in the eyes, and offered what could only be described as a military salute, sitting perfectly upright, one massive paw raised in a gesture that made the seasoned Marine officer's eyes fill with tears. "Semper Fi, Spirit," she whispered. "David would be proud." Tuesday afternoon brought a different kind of storm. The morning's military revelation had attracted national media attention, transforming the White Horse Ranch into an unlikely battleground between those who saw Spirit as a war hero deserving peace and those who viewed him as a dangerous predator masquerading as a pet. CNN had picked up the story by 2:00 p.m. Fox News followed an hour later. By evening, satellite trucks lined the country road leading to the ranch, their generators humming like mechanical insects in the Montana twilight. 21 hours remained until the original euthanasia deadline, though Colonel Hayes's intervention had technically suspended the order pending federal review. Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching reporters set up equipment on his front lawn. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he told Grace, who was resting on the couch with Luna pressed protectively against her side. We just wanted to give one broken animal a quiet place to heal." Through the sliding glass door they could see Spirit in his enclosure, completely unruffled by the media circus. He had positioned himself where he could monitor both the house and the driveway, his amber eyes tracking every newcomer with professional assessment. When a photographer got too close to the fence, Spirit simply moved to a different vantage point, maintaining his watch without apparent concern. Grace's phone buzzed with a text from her sister in Seattle. "Watching you on the news right now. Mom and Dad would be so proud. That Bobcat has David's eyes." The comparison wasn't lost on Samuel. In the fading light, Spirit's amber gaze held the same quiet intensity David had possessed. Alert without being aggressive, protective without being possessive. It was a soldier's watchfulness, born from training and tempered by loss. Elder Joseph Blackhorse arrived just as the evening news broadcasts were beginning. The 73-year-old Lakota elder had been fielding calls all day from tribal members across the region, many offering support for what they saw as a sacred reunion between warrior spirits. "The media wants to interview you," Samuel told him. "They're calling it a Native American spiritual angle." Joseph's weathered face showed mild amusement. "White folks always want to put labels on medicine they don't understand. This isn't about angles or stories. This is about healing finding its way home." The Facebook battle had escalated throughout the day. The Concerned Citizens of Pine Valley group now had over 1,200 members, with heated debates raging in the comments sections. Janet Morrison had organized a petition demanding Spirit's immediate removal, gathering 300 signatures from people who'd never seen a bobcat outside of nature documentaries. But the counter-movement was gaining momentum. Veterans for Spirit had formed spontaneously, led by Tom Bradley and other local military families. Their petition supporting the white horses had reached 500 signatures and climbing, with testimonials from soldiers who'd worked with therapy animals overseas. Angela Rodriguez, the Gold Star mother who'd defended Spirit the previous day, had driven up from Denver with a carload of military family members. They stood in peaceful solidarity outside the ranch gates, holding signs reading "Honor our four-legged veterans" and "Healing comes in many forms." The most powerful supporter was unexpected. Master Sergeant Maria Elena Santos, a retired Marine who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, stepped out of a pickup truck wearing her dress blues and carrying a folded American flag. "That Bobcat," she told the news cameras, "worked with my unit in Helmand Province. I watched him calm Marines having panic attacks when our medics couldn't get through to them. If he's found his way to a family that needs him, that's not coincidence. That's completion of his mission." Samuel felt his chest tighten. He'd never heard of Maria Santos, but her words carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed Spirit's work firsthand. "You knew our son, David?" "Sergeant Whitehorse was legend in our unit," Maria replied, her voice thick with emotion. "The way he worked with Spirit was something special. That animal learned to read human trauma like a book. If he's chosen your family, there's a reason." As darkness fell, the scene took on an almost mystical quality. The media lights created harsh islands of illumination in the natural landscape, but Spirit remained in the shadows of his enclosure, a watchful presence that seemed to understand he was the center of something much larger than himself. Grace emerged from the house carrying David's Purple Heart in its display case. She walked slowly to Spirit's enclosure, her movements deliberate despite the afternoon's medical episode. The gathered crowd fell silent as she approached the fence. "This belonged to your friend," she said softly, holding up the medal where Spirit could see it. "He earned it the day he tried to save his squad from an IED. The same day you probably tried to save him." Spirit approached the fence with unprecedented directness. He studied the Purple Heart with intense focus, then looked up at Grace with an expression that made several reporters gasp. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed his massive head against the chain link where Grace's hand rested on the other side. The moment was captured by a dozen cameras, but its significance transcended mere photography. Here was a wild predator, capable of killing with minimal effort, choosing tenderness over violence, connection over isolation. Dr. Rebecca Martinez arrived just as the crowd was processing this extraordinary display. The neurologist from Billings had driven 3 hours after receiving an urgent call about Grace's medical episode. What she found challenged everything she thought she knew about cognitive health. "Mrs. Whitehorse," she said after a brief examination, "your cognitive function tests from this morning are remarkable. The improvements since your last visit 6 months ago are, well, they're unprecedented." "What kind of improvements?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Memory retention, spatial reasoning, emotional regulation, all showing significant enhancement. In my 30 years of neurology, I've never documented cognitive improvement in early-stage Alzheimer's. The disease simply doesn't work that way." Grace squeezed Samuel's hand. They both understood what Dr. Martinez was too professionally cautious to say outright. Spirit's presence was somehow slowing, perhaps even reversing, Grace's cognitive decline. "There are documented cases, Doctor." Martinez continued carefully, "of animal companionship providing therapeutic benefits for dementia patients. But this level of improvement, it would require long-term study to understand the mechanisms involved." Elder Joseph stepped forward, his presence commanding respect even among the medical professionals. "In our traditions, we understand that healing comes from connection, to family, to purpose, to the sacred relationships that bind all living things together. This animal didn't come here by accident." The crowd had grown throughout the evening. Local residents who'd initially opposed Spirit's placement were beginning to see something they hadn't expected. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow from town, approached Samuel with tears in her eyes. "I signed that petition against you this morning," she admitted, "but watching the news tonight, seeing how that animal responded to your wife, my husband had dementia before he passed. If there's even a chance that creature could help other families like yours." The shift in public opinion was becoming palpable. The fear-based rhetoric of the morning was giving way to something more complex, a recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary. As midnight approached, marking 18 hours until the original deadline, Samuel found himself standing alone with Spirit. The media had finally powered down their equipment, the crowds had dispersed, and the ranch had returned to its natural quiet. "You know, don't you?" Samuel said to the Bobcat through the fence. "You know exactly what you're doing here." Spirit's amber eyes reflected the porch light as he settled into his favorite resting position, sphinx-like, alert but peaceful. His purr rumbled softly in the darkness, a sound like distant thunder carrying the promise of rain after a long drought. "Darkest hours just before dawn," Samuel whispered, using his father's old saying. David always believed that. Maybe he still does. In the house behind him, Grace slept peacefully for the first time in months, her hand resting on David's purple heart. Outside, a wild creature who'd traveled impossible distances to find his way home kept watch over the family that had been chosen to receive the greatest gift a warrior could offer: proof that love transcends death, and that some promises can never be broken. The nightmare began at 2:47 a.m., 15 hours before the deadline. Samuel's screams shattered the Montana silence like breaking glass, pulling Grace from deep sleep into the familiar horror of her husband's PTSD episodes. She found him on the living room floor, pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror that belonged to battlefields 30 years past. "Contact left! Contact left!" Samuel shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. David, get down now! Grace had witnessed dozens of these episodes over the decades, triggered by everything from helicopter sounds to sudden movements. But tonight was different. Tonight, Samuel wasn't just reliving his own Vietnam trauma. He was trapped in the nightmare of losing David, the two wars blending into one endless cycle of violence and loss. "Samuel, you're home," Grace said softly, keeping her distance as the VA counselor had taught her. "You're safe. David is at peace." But Samuel couldn't hear her. In his mind, he was simultaneously 19 and 67, watching his son die in a war he'd never fought, carrying guilt that belonged to two different decades. His hands clawed at the hardwood floor as if digging a foxhole, his breathing rapid and shallow. Outside, the media lights flickered back to life. The overnight news crews had been waiting for exactly this kind of drama, and Samuel's cries had carried across the still night air. Within minutes, cameras were rolling, capturing footage that would be replayed endlessly across morning talk shows. Grace's heart broke as she watched her husband fight invisible enemies in their living room. The stress of the past 48 hours, the media attention, the legal battles, the weight of David's hidden letters had finally shattered the fragile control Samuel maintained over his war memories. "Please," she whispered to no one in particular. "Please, help him." That's when the impossible happened. Spirit's urgent barking cut through the night like a siren, not the casual vocalizations they'd heard before, but sharp, commanding calls that demanded immediate attention. Grace looked toward the sliding glass door and saw the Bobcat pressed against his enclosure fence, his entire body rigid with purpose. The barking continued, rhythmic and insistent. Grace realized Spirit wasn't making random noise. He was creating a pattern. 3 short barks, pause. 3 short barks, pause. The same cadence military personnel used for emergency signals. "He's trying to help," Grace breathed, understanding flooding through her. Samuel's head jerked toward the sound, his combat instincts responding to what his conscious mind couldn't process. The barking wasn't triggering his flight or fight response. It was grounding him, giving his fractured awareness something concrete to focus on. Grace made a decision that terrified her. She opened the sliding glass door. "Grace, no!" Maria Standing Bear's voice came from the driveway where she'd been sleeping in her van, keeping vigil during the media siege. "The enclosure is secure, but if you let him out—" "He's not trying to get out," Grace said with absolute certainty. "He's trying to get to Samuel." Spirit's response proved her right. When the door opened, he didn't attempt to escape his enclosure. Instead, he moved to the section closest to the house and began a low, rhythmic vocalization. Not quite a purr, not quite a growl, but something uniquely soothing that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Samuel's panicked breathing began to slow. His eyes, wild with decades-old terror, gradually focused on the amber gaze watching him through the glass door. For the first time since the episode began, he seemed to recognize where he was. "Spirit?" Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. The Bobcat's response was immediate and purposeful. He positioned himself in clear view of the living room and began what could only be described as breathing exercises, slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that created visible vapor in the cold night air. "Follow his breathing, Samuel," Grace urged, recognizing therapeutic techniques she'd never seen an animal perform. In with spirit, out with spirit. For 20 minutes, the most dangerous predator in Montana became a meditation teacher, guiding a broken veteran through the breathing patterns that could pull him back from the edge of psychological collapse. The news cameras captured every moment, but the significance was lost on reporters who saw only a man and an animal sharing space across a barrier. Samuel's breathing gradually synchronized with Spirit's. His death grip on the floor loosened. The wild look faded from his eyes, replaced by exhaustion and embarrassment. How long? He asked Grace, the question every PTSD family understood. About an hour, she replied, not mentioning the cameras or the fact that his breakdown had been broadcast live across 3 news networks. Elder Joseph Blackhorse arrived just as Samuel was struggling to his feet. The Lakota elder had felt the disturbance in his bones, he later said, and driven through the darkness guided by instincts older than GPS systems. "Grandfather," he said to Spirit in Lakota, "you have strong medicine." But the night's trials weren't finished. Grace's phone buzzed with an emergency alert. "Amber alert. Child missing from Pine Valley area. Emma Patterson, age 7, last seen wearing pink pajamas. Believed to have wandered from home during confusion caused by media presence." Mrs. Patterson, the same woman who'd apologized for signing the petition against Spirit, had been so distraught by the evening's events that she'd left her front door unlocked. Her granddaughter Emma, visiting for the week, had apparently wandered outside sometime after midnight. In the chaos of media trucks and overnight protests, no one had noticed a small child walking into the Montana wilderness. "She's been missing for 3 hours, Grace said, reading the alert details. "They've got search teams forming, but in this darkness—" Samuel forced himself upright despite his exhaustion. "I know those woods. We need to—" Spirit's sudden change in behavior cut him off. The Bobcat was no longer focused on the house. Instead, he was positioned at the far corner of his enclosure, nose to the wind, body alert with hunting tension. But this wasn't predatory behavior. It was tracking behavior. "He's caught a scent," Elder Joseph observed. "Something that doesn't belong in these woods." Maria Standing Bear had been watching Spirit's body language with professional interest. "That's not prey tracking. That's search and rescue positioning. Some therapy animals are trained for missing person scenarios." The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. "You think he can track Emma?" "I think," Maria said carefully, "that Spirit has training we're only beginning to understand." The search teams were already deploying across the mountainside, their flashlights creating moving constellations in the darkness. But they were searching blind, following grid patterns through terrain that could hide a child in 1,000 different ways. Spirit had something they didn't: a nose capable of detecting individual human scents across miles of wilderness, and training that had been honed in the life-or-death scenarios of military service. "We can't," Grace said, reading her husband's thoughts. "The liability alone. If something happened to that child while Spirit was involved—" "If something happens to her because we didn't try," Samuel replied, "I'll never forgive myself." The debate was interrupted by Sheriff Tom Bradley, the same Vietnam veteran who'd supported Spirit from the beginning. "Samuel, I need to ask you something that's going to sound crazy. That Bobcat of yours, is there any chance he could help find Emma Patterson?" Samuel looked at Spirit, who was now pacing the perimeter of his enclosure with obvious agitation. The Bobcat's training was asserting itself, every instinct screaming that there was a mission to complete, a life to save. "Sheriff," Elder Joseph said quietly, "in our traditions, we believe that spirits come to us when we need them most. This animal has already saved one man tonight. Perhaps that was practice for something larger." The news crews caught wind of the missing child story within minutes. Suddenly, the Bobcat, who'd been vilified as a dangerous predator, was being repositioned as a potential hero. Public opinion, already shifting after witnessing Spirit's response to Samuel's crisis, swung dramatically toward hope. But hope was dangerous. If Spirit failed to find Emma, or worse, if his presence somehow complicated the search, the backlash would be swift and merciless. Everything they'd fought for, Spirit's placement, his veteran status, his future with the family, would be destroyed. Grace found herself facing the most impossible decision of her life: trust the wild creature who'd already worked miracles, or protect him from a situation that could end in tragedy for everyone involved. In the distance, Emma Patterson's grandmother stood at the edge of the search perimeter, clutching a pink blanket and praying to any god who might be listening. 7 years old and alone in wilderness that could kill an experienced adult. "Some gifts come wrapped in strange packages," Grace whispered, her grandmother's wisdom echoing across generations. The clock showed 5:30 a.m., 9.5 hours until the original euthanasia deadline. But time had taken on different meaning now. Emma Patterson had been missing for over 4 hours, and every minute reduced her chances of survival. Spirit pressed against his enclosure fence, amber eyes fixed on the darkness beyond, waiting for a decision that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of a lost child and the family that had chosen to believe in impossible things. The decision came at dawn. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had arrived at 6 a.m. with equipment that would change everything they thought they knew about cognitive health and animal therapy. Her overnight analysis of Grace's brain scans revealed patterns that defied medical explanation, not just improvement but regeneration in areas typically ravaged by Alzheimer's. "Mrs. Whitehorse," Dr. Martinez said, her voice tight with controlled excitement, "I've sent these results to 3 different neurological institutes. The consensus is unanimous. This level of cognitive recovery is medically impossible under conventional understanding." Grace sat in her kitchen chair, watching Spirit through the window as search teams continued combing the mountainside for Emma Patterson. 6 hours missing now. The child's chances of survival were dropping with each passing hour, but the searchers had found no trace. "What are you saying, doctor?" Samuel asked, though the answer was written in the neurologist's expression. "I'm saying that Spirit's presence appears to be triggering neuroplasticity responses we've never documented. Your wife's brain is literally rewiring itself, creating new neural pathways to compensate for damaged areas. The mechanism is unknown, but the results are extraordinary." Elder Joseph nodded from his position by the window. "In our traditions, healing animals carry medicine that works beyond the physical world. They touch the spirit where Western medicine cannot reach." But the miraculous news was overshadowed by the crisis unfolding outside. Sheriff Bradley approached the house at 6:30 a.m., his face grave with exhaustion and growing desperation. "Samuel, we've searched every trail within a 5-mile radius. No sign of Emma. The temperature dropped to 32 degrees last night. If she's not found in the next few hours..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Mrs. Patterson stood beside the sheriff, her face haggard with guilt and terror. "Please," she said to Samuel, her earlier opposition to Spirit forgotten in the face of losing her granddaughter. "If there's any chance that animal can help..." Spirit had been agitated since dawn, pacing his enclosure with the restless energy of a creature denied its purpose. His amber eyes tracked every searcher, every helicopter pass, every piece of equipment brought to bear on the rescue effort. It was the behavior of an expert observer, cataloging resources and calculating probabilities. "He's trained for this," Maria Standing Bear said with growing conviction. "Search and rescue was part of the military therapy program. I've seen the documentation." Samuel looked at his wife, seeing the clarity in her eyes that Dr. Martinez's miracle couldn't fully explain. Grace nodded once, understanding passing between them without words. "What would you need from us?" Samuel asked Sheriff Bradley. "Total supervision, multiple handlers, liability waivers from the county, state, and federal level, and acceptance that if this goes wrong, Spirit's placement ends immediately." The paperwork took 45 minutes to complete. Forms that should have required days of bureaucratic processing were expedited through emergency protocols, with Colonel Hayes providing federal authorization via encrypted phone calls from Colorado Springs. At 7:15 a.m., Spirit was fitted with a specialized tracking collar and released from his enclosure under the direct supervision of 3 wildlife experts, 2 search and rescue coordinators, and Sheriff Bradley himself. The moment Spirit was free, his behavior transformed completely. The relaxed domestic animal vanished, replaced by a focused predator operating at peak efficiency. He immediately began scent work, nose to the ground, covering territory with methodical precision. Within 10 minutes, he had isolated Emma's trail. "He's got something," announced Sarah Chin, the search coordinator from Billings. "Look at that body language. That's a positive indication." Spirit moved with purpose now, following a scent trail invisible to human senses. His path led away from the organized search grid toward a section of wilderness the teams had dismissed as too difficult for a 7-year-old to navigate. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they followed Spirit's lead. Rocky outcroppings, fallen timber, and dense undergrowth created obstacles that would challenge experienced hikers. But Spirit pressed forward with unwavering confidence, pausing only to verify the scent trail at critical decision points. "How could a child get this far?" Maria muttered, scrambling over a fallen log that stood 3 feet high. "Fear makes people do impossible things," Elder Joseph replied, keeping pace despite his 73 years. "She was running from the noise, the lights, the chaos. Children run until they can't run anymore." After 90 minutes of difficult tracking, Spirit stopped abruptly at the edge of a steep ravine. His body went rigid, ears forward, nose testing the air with rapid precision. Then he began the urgent barking pattern they'd heard the night before. 3 sharp calls, pause, repeat. "She's down there," Samuel said with absolute certainty. The rescue team rappelled into the ravine while Spirit maintained his position at the rim, continuing his alert calls. 40 feet below, they found Emma Patterson wedged beneath an overhanging rock formation, unconscious but breathing, hypothermic, dehydrated but alive. The child's rescue played out live on national television. Every network carried footage of the unlikely search team. A combat veteran with PTSD, his wife fighting Alzheimer's, a Lakota elder, and a Bobcat who'd traveled impossible distances to find his way home. But the story took a devastating turn as they prepared to transport Emma to the hospital. Dr. Martinez received an emergency call while Emma was being loaded into the ambulance. "Mrs. Whitehorse," she said, her face pale with shock, "I need to tell you something about your brain scans. I've been in consultation with specialists all morning." Grace looked up from where she was comforting Mrs. Patterson, Emma's grandmother. "What is it, doctor?" "Your improvement isn't just neuroplasticity. We've found evidence of actual tissue regeneration in areas where Alzheimer's damage was previously irreversible. The rate of healing is, well, it's beyond anything in medical literature." Samuel felt the world shift around him. "Are you saying Grace is cured?" "I'm saying that continued exposure to Spirit appears to be reversing her condition in ways we can't explain or replicate. But—" Dr. Martinez hesitated, struggling with implications that challenged everything she'd been trained to believe. "But what?" Grace asked. "But removing Spirit from your environment could cause rapid cognitive decline. The bonding mechanism appears to be specific and irreversible. Without continued contact—" She didn't need to finish. Grace's miraculous recovery was dependent on Spirit's presence. Separating them could kill her as surely as a bullet. The news broke just as Emma Patterson was being airlifted to Billings General Hospital. Miracle Bobcat saves missing child, may hold key to Alzheimer's cure. Within hours, the story had gone viral globally, attracting attention from medical researchers, military historians, and wildlife experts around the world. But fame brought new dangers. The Department of Defense wanted to study Spirit's therapeutic mechanisms. Medical institutions offered millions for research access. Wildlife advocacy groups demanded his return to natural habitat. Each faction claimed moral authority over his fate. The most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. Federal wildlife officials, responding to pressure from animal rights organizations, announced that Spirit's veteran status was under review. A preliminary ruling suggested that no wild animal, regardless of military service, should be permanently housed in private facilities. "They're saying that keeping Spirit is tantamount to imprisonment," Sheriff Bradley explained, reading from official documents. "That no matter how bonded he is to your family, his wild nature demands freedom." The irony was crushing. Spirit's success in saving Emma had triggered a backlash that threatened everything they'd fought to achieve. The very demonstration of his value as a therapy animal was being used as evidence that he should be removed from therapeutic situations. Grace sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. Without Spirit, her cognitive improvements would reverse. Samuel's PTSD symptoms would return with vengeance. The animal who'd saved their family would be torn away by bureaucrats who'd never witnessed his healing power. "There has to be something we can do," Samuel said. But his voice carried the hollow tone of a man who'd fought bureaucracy before and lost. Mrs. Patterson, still clutching her rescued granddaughter's pink blanket, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "That animal saved Emma's life. If anyone tries to take him away from the people who love him, they'll have to go through every mother and grandmother in this state." Elder Joseph placed his weathered hand on Grace's shoulder. "Sometimes the spirits test our faith before they grant us the greatest gifts." And this is not the end of the story. But as the sun climbed higher over Montana, casting long shadows across the ranch that had become a symbol of impossible healing, the clock continued its relentless countdown. 7 hours until the original euthanasia deadline. 7 hours to find a solution that would satisfy federal wildlife officials, medical researchers, military bureaucrats, and the simple truth that some bonds transcend human understanding. Spirit watched it all from his enclosure, amber eyes holding the patient wisdom of a creature who'd already accomplished his mission. He'd brought his chosen family together, healed their deepest wounds, and proven that love could triumph over loss. Now he waited to discover if human gratitude was stronger than human fear. The call came at 12:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the original euthanasia deadline. Federal Judge Catherine Blackwood was conferencing from her chambers in Helena, her voice crackling through the speakerphone in Sheriff Bradley's office, where an unlikely coalition had gathered for a final appeal. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Blackwood began, "in 40 years on the federal bench, I have never reviewed a case quite like this one. We have a military therapy animal whose service record is classified, a family whose medical needs are documented as unprecedented, and a community whose safety concerns must be balanced against individual rights." Samuel held Grace's hand as they sat surrounded by supporters who'd arrived throughout the morning. Mrs. Patterson was there with Emma, the 7-year-old still weak but insisting on attending. Colonel Hayes had driven up from Colorado Springs. Elder Joseph sat in traditional regalia, having declared this a sacred proceeding. "Doctor." Martinez clutched her medical files containing evidence that challenged everything the scientific community believed about cognitive recovery. Outside the sheriff's office, news crews from every major network maintained their vigil. The story had captured international attention, a wounded warrior's final gift to his family, delivered through a wild creature who'd traveled impossible distances to find his way home. "Your Honor," Colonel Hayes spoke first, her military bearing evident even through the phone connection. "Spirit's service record includes 17 documented cases of suicide prevention, 43 successful PTSD interventions, and specialized training that represents a $1 million investment in military resources. His therapeutic value is beyond question." "Colonel, I understand his military value," Judge Blackwood replied. But federal wildlife law doesn't recognize therapeutic exceptions for privately housed exotic animals regardless of their training. Samuel found his voice, though it shook with emotion. Your Honor, my son David gave his life in service to this country. His final gift was sending spirit to heal the wounds his death left behind. Are we really going to dishonor that sacrifice by destroying the very thing he died to protect? Mr. Whitehorse, the law exists to protect both animals and humans from inappropriate captivity situations. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. Your Honor, may I present medical evidence that spirit's removal would constitute a death sentence for Mrs. Whitehorse. Her cognitive recovery is directly linked to his presence. Separation would trigger rapid decline that could prove fatal. The silence stretched long enough that Samuel thought they'd lost the connection. Finally, Judge Blackwood's voice returned, heavy with the weight of an impossible decision. Dr. Martinez, you're asking me to believe that a wild animal can cure Alzheimer's disease. I'm documenting that this specific animal has triggered neurological recovery in this specific patient through mechanisms we don't yet understand. The brain scans don't lie, Your Honor. This is either a medical miracle or the most sophisticated fraud in neurological history. Emma Patterson's small voice cut through the adult debate like a knife. Your Honor, Spirit found me when I was lost. He saved my life. If you take him away, who's going to save other people? Judge Blackwood cleared her throat. Young lady, that's a very good question. Elder Joseph rose to his feet, his 73 years lending gravity to every word. Your Honor, I am Joseph Blackhorse, elder of the Lakota Nation. In our traditions, we understand that some relationships transcend human law. This animal chose this family. That choice carries medicine that your courts cannot legislate. Mr. Blackhorse, with all respect for tribal traditions, federal wildlife law applies to all citizens. Yes, Joseph replied calmly, but federal law also recognizes tribal sovereignty and spiritual practices. I am formally requesting that Spirit be granted status as a sacred animal under the Native American Religious Freedom Act. The legal maneuver was brilliant and unexpected. Samuel saw Colonel Hayes nod approvingly while Dr. Martinez quickly shuffled through her files, understanding the implications. Furthermore, Joseph continued, Mrs. Whitehorse is an enrolled member of the Lakota Nation through her grandmother's lineage. Her medical treatment involving spirit constitutes traditional healing practices protected under federal law. Judge Blackwood's pause stretched even longer this time. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted subtly. Mr. Blackhorse, are you formally establishing spirit as a traditional healing animal under tribal religious protections? I am, Your Honor, and I am requesting that Mrs. Whitehorse's medical treatment be recognized as a sacred healing ceremony that cannot be interrupted by federal wildlife regulations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Standing Bear had been quietly working her phone throughout the hearing, coordinating with wildlife officials across 3 states. Your Honor, she interjected, I've just received confirmation from the Department of Interior. They're prepared to create a new classification, Therapeutic Wildlife Veteran, that would allow spirit to remain with the Whitehorse family under specific protocols. What kind of protocols? Judge Blackwood asked. Regular veterinary care, behavioral monitoring, community safety assessments, and most importantly, documentation of his therapeutic work for potential replication with other veterans and medical patients. Samuel felt hope flickering back to life. Your Honor, we accept any reasonable oversight. We just want to keep our family together. Colonel Hayes stepped forward. Your Honor, I have authorization to propose federal legislation, the David Whitehorse Military Animal Companion Act, that would create legal framework for retired therapy animals to remain with qualified families. Spirit would be the pilot case. The room fell silent, except for the mechanical hum of the speakerphone. Outside, they could hear the rumble of the gathered crowd. Hundreds of people who'd driven from across Montana to support a family they'd never met, and a bobcat who'd captured the nation's heart. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Blackwood said finally, "this case involves multiple federal jurisdictions, tribal sovereignty, military regulations, medical ethics, and wildlife law. Under normal circumstances, it would require months of litigation to resolve." Samuel's heart sank, but the judge wasn't finished. "However, these are not normal circumstances. We have a child whose life was saved, a veteran whose PTSD is being successfully treated, a woman whose Alzheimer's symptoms have reversed, and a community that has witnessed something extraordinary. More importantly, we have an animal who has demonstrated behavior that challenges our understanding of human-animal relationships." Grace squeezed Samuel's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. "Therefore, I am issuing an emergency ruling under federal humanitarian guidelines. Spirit will be granted therapeutic wildlife veteran status, effective immediately. He will remain with the Whitehorse family under the oversight of the Department of Veterans Affairs, working in collaboration with the Indian Health Service to document traditional healing practices." The eruption of cheers from the crowd outside was audible through the office walls. Mrs. Patterson burst into tears, hugging Emma tightly. Colonel Hayes saluted even though no one could see her. Elder Joseph nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd always known how this story would end. But Judge Blackwood wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I am ordering the establishment of a federal research program to study the therapeutic mechanisms Spirit demonstrates. If his healing abilities can be replicated or understood, we have a moral obligation to share that knowledge with veterans and families facing similar challenges." Samuel felt tears streaming down his face as he processed the magnitude of what had just happened. Not only was Spirit safe, but his gift would be studied and potentially shared with countless others who needed healing. "Your Honor," Grace said, her voice steady and clear, "thank you for giving us the chance to honor our son's final gift. Mrs. Whitehorse, thank you for showing us that healing comes in many forms." As the call ended, the office erupted in celebration, but the most meaningful moment came when they returned to the ranch and found Spirit waiting in his enclosure, completely calm, as if he'd known all along how this would end. Samuel opened the enclosure gate, not to release Spirit, but to join him. Grace followed, then Elder Joseph, then one by one the people who'd fought for this moment. Spirit moved among them with quiet dignity, touching each person with gentle head bumps, purring with the sound of distant thunder that spoke of journeys completed and promises kept. As the Montana sunset painted the mountains in gold and crimson, 3 generations gathered on the front porch of the Whitehorse Ranch. Samuel in his recliner, Grace in her rocker, Emma Patterson curled up on the couch with Luna and Cooper. And Spirit, the wild creature who'd traveled impossible distances to find his way home, stretched across all of them like a living bridge between worlds. "Home is where the heart heals," Grace said, using one of her grandmother's favorite sayings. Samuel nodded, scratching behind Spirit's ears as the bobcat's purr rumbled through the peaceful evening. David kept his promise after all. Elder Joseph smiled from his chair by the fire. The spirits always keep their promises. Sometimes it just takes us a while to understand what they're trying to say. In the distance, the lights of Pine Valley twinkled like earthbound stars, and the night held the promise of tomorrow. Spirit had found his purpose, his family, his home. David's final gift had been delivered, and the healing would continue for generations to come. The warrior had come home at last. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Like many of you, Samuel and Grace Whitehorse thought their story of love and loss was finished when they lost their son David in Afghanistan 7 years ago. Samuel's PTSD nightmares, Grace's early Alzheimer's symptoms, the empty chair at the dinner table. They'd accepted that some wounds never heal, that some families never recover from tragedy. But then Spirit arrived, a wounded bobcat carrying David's love home in amber eyes and a warrior's heart. What followed wasn't just healing, it was transformation. Samuel's nightmares replaced by peaceful sleep. Grace's memory restored beyond medical explanation. A family rebuilt through the unconditional love of a creature who'd traveled impossible distances to keep a promise. This story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, that healing can come from the most surprising sources, and that the love between family members, whether human or otherwise, can literally work miracles. Your own story of resilience and unexpected blessings might be just beginning. What unexpected gift has brought healing to your family? Have you ever experienced a connection with an animal that changed your perspective on life? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love found its way back to you.